In an elegant meeting room, a $1 million contract hid a clause that no one there expected to question. It was a 10-year-old girl, the cleaning lady's daughter, who raised her voice, in fluent German, to reveal the danger. Executives laughed, the lawyer froze, and the silence was broken when she read line by line the hidden trap. At that moment, everything changed. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching us from. We'll keep going. The sharp June sun beat down on Richard Blackwood's shoulders as he stepped out of his black Audi, loosening his tie with a practiced movement. The unexpected early return to his Portland estate wasn't planned. A cancelled meeting had freed up his afternoon, a rarity for the CEO of Blackwood Manufacturing, one of Oregon's largest furniture production companies. 20 years of building his empire had conditioned Richard to maximize every minute. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications as he silenced it and slipped it into his pocket. For once the world could wait. The pristine lawn stretched before him, leading to the colonial-style mansion that overlooked the Willamette Valley's lush landscape. As he approached, voices carried across the garden. Richard paused, his attention caught by a heated exchange coming from near the gazebo. The scene unfolding before him felt surreal, like watching a movie playing out in his own backyard. There was his 12-year-old son, Mason, in his wheelchair, partially shielded by Nancy Miller, their longtime housekeeper, who was kneeling protectively in front of him. Facing them was Vanessa, Richard's wife of 3 years, her voice sharp and insistent. "He needs to spend time in the sun. It will strengthen his bones." Vanessa's words cut through the humid air. "This coddling isn't helping anyone." "Mrs. Blackwood, please." Nancy's usually reserved voice had taken on an edge Richard had never heard before. Dr. Harrison specifically said, "Mason needs to limit direct sun exposure because of his medication. He's not a plant to be forced into the sunlight. He has feelings." Mason sat silently, his thin shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on his lap. The boy had never been one to voice his discomfort, a quality that made Richard proud and heartbroken in equal measure. "I know what's best for this household," Vanessa continued, oblivious to Richard's approach. "When my sister had that skiing accident, sun therapy was exactly what the doctor ordered." Richard cleared his throat. 3 heads turned simultaneously in his direction. "Richard!" Vanessa's expression transformed instantly, a practiced smile replacing her scowl. "You're home early, darling. I was just suggesting Mason get some fresh air." Nancy stood slowly, her hand remaining protectively on Mason's shoulder. "Mr. Blackwood, I was just about to take Mason inside for his physical therapy session." Richard looked at his son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in months. The boy's complexion was pale, his eyes hollow. How long had Mason looked this way? Had Richard been too consumed with quarterly reports and expansion plans to notice? "Dad, it's okay," Mason said quietly. "I was just going in anyway." Something in his son's voice, resignation, perhaps, or a practiced pacification, struck Richard like a physical blow. "Nancy, please take Mason inside," Richard said, his voice controlled despite the unease growing within him. "I'll speak with my wife." As Nancy wheeled Mason toward the house, Richard turned to Vanessa. Her perfect posture, designer sundress and manicured nails painted a picture of the ideal trophy wife. It was what had attracted him initially, her polished presence a stark contrast to the earthy warmth of his first wife. Eleanor, whose unexpected illness had taken her when Mason was just 7. What exactly was happening out here? Richard asked once they were alone. "Nothing worth discussing," Vanessa waved dismissively. "Nancy overreacts when it comes to Mason. She acts like she's his mother." "Because she's been more present than either of us," Richard said. The admission painful but necessary. "Don't be dramatic, Richard. I've done everything expected of me as a stepmother. I attend his parent-teacher conferences. I make sure he has everything he needs." "But do you care about what he wants?" Richard interrupted. "Have you ever asked him?" Vanessa's composure slipped momentarily before she regained control. "Let's not do this now. The Hendersons are coming for dinner tomorrow, and I need to finalize the menu with the caterer." She brushed past him toward the house, leaving Richard standing alone in the garden that Eleanor had once lovingly tended. Now it was maintained by a landscaping service, beautiful but lacking the personal touch that had once made it feel like home. Inside the house, Richard found Nancy preparing Mason's medication in the kitchen. The housekeeper had been with them since before Mason was born. At 55, with salt and pepper hair always neatly tied back and warm brown eyes that missed nothing, Nancy had been the consistent presence in their lives through Eleanor's illness and after her passing. "How long has this been going on?" Richard asked quietly. Nancy measured the liquid medication carefully before answering. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't think it's my place to—" "Nancy," Richard's voice was gentle but firm, "we've known each other for 15 years. If something's happening in my home that affects my son, I need to know." Nancy placed the medicine on a tray alongside a glass of water. "Mason needs someone to see him," she said finally. "Not just look at him, but really see him." The simple statement hit Richard with unexpected force. When was the last time he'd spent a full day with his son? When had they last talked about anything beyond school grades and medical appointments? "Take the evening off, Nancy," Richard said suddenly. "I'll handle Mason's routine tonight." Surprise flickered across Nancy's face. "Are you sure?" "His evening exercises are important, and the sequence is specific." "He can show me," Richard said, taking the tray from her hands. "I think it's time I learned." Nancy nodded, something like hope in her eyes. "His journal is by his bedside. He likes to write before sleep. And Mr. Blackwood, he loves listening to those old jazz records that belonged to Mrs. Eleanor." Richard carried the tray upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. Mason's room was at the end of the hallway, specially modified after the accident 5 years ago that had changed everything. Her drunk driver, a rainy night, and suddenly Eleanor was gone and Mason would never walk again. The door was partially open. Richard knocked gently before entering. Mason was by the window, his wheelchair positioned to overlook the garden and the mountains beyond. "Hey, champ," Richard said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Thought maybe we could hang out tonight." Mason looked up, surprise and wariness mingling in his expression. "Don't you have work stuff?" "There's that contract with the Seattle distributor." The fact that his 12-year-old knew about his business dealings made Richard's heart sink. "Nothing that can't wait. How about we order pizza and watch that sci-fi show you mentioned last month?" "You mean Cosmic Frontiers? You really want to watch that?" "Absolutely," Richard said, surprised by how much he meant it. "But first, tell me what happened with Vanessa today." Mason's gaze dropped back to his lap. "It's not a big deal, Dad. She just wants to help, I guess." "In her own way," Richard said carefully. "But that doesn't mean it's the right way. What do your doctors actually say about sun exposure?" "Dr. Harrison says my medication makes my skin more sensitive," Mason explained. "Too much direct sunlight can cause a reaction. Vanessa doesn't really listen during appointments." "Does she attend your medical appointments often?" A slight hesitation. "She comes to the initial consultations, but usually has to leave early. Nancy stays for the whole thing." Richard pulled up a chair beside his son's wheelchair. "Mason, I need you to be honest with me. Are you happy? Not just okay, but actually happy?" The question hung in the air between them, weighty with implications. Mason's fingers twisted in his lap, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "I miss Mom," he said finally, his voice small. "I know it's been 5 years, but I still miss her every day." "I miss her too," Richard admitted, his throat tight. "Sometimes I feel like I'm invisible in this house," Mason continued, the words coming faster now. "Except to Nancy, she sees me." "And Vanessa?" Richard asked, though he was beginning to fear he already knew the answer. Mason's silence spoke volumes. "I'm sorry," Richard said, the inadequacy of the words stinging his tongue. "I've been failing you, haven't I?" "You're busy," Mason said with a shrug that tried to be casual but couldn't quite manage it. "The company needs you." "You need me more," Richard said firmly. "And starting tonight, things are going to change." As evening fell over Portland, father and son shared pizza and laughter for the first time in too long. But even as Richard helped Mason through his evening exercises and tucked him into bed, a disquiet remained. What else had he missed? What other currents ran beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life? In the master bedroom, Vanessa was already in bed, scrolling through her phone. She barely glanced up as Richard entered. "The Hendersons confirmed for tomorrow," she said. "Victoria mentioned bringing that new couple they've befriended. He's in real estate development." Could be useful for that riverfront property you've been eyeing. Richard stood at the foot of the bed studying the woman he'd married. Had there been signs from the beginning that he'd missed? Or had he simply chosen not to see them? Vanessa, he said quietly, we need to talk about Mason. Mason? Vanessa set her phone aside with a sigh. Richard, it's almost midnight. Can't this wait until tomorrow? No, Richard said firmly, it can't. Something in his tone made Vanessa sit up straighter, her perfectly manicured fingernails smoothing the silk sheets. What's this about? That little scene with Nancy? She overstepped, Richard. The staff needs boundaries. Nancy was protecting my son, Richard replied, keeping his voice even despite the anger building inside him. From my wife. Vanessa's laugh was brittle. Protecting? Don't be dramatic. I was trying to help the boy get some vitamin D. He's so pale, always inside with those video games and books. His name is Mason, not the boy, and his medication makes his skin photosensitive. His doctors have been clear about limiting sun exposure. Information you would know if you paid attention during his appointments. A flash of irritation crossed Vanessa's face. I have social obligations, Richard. The charity board, the country club events, all things that benefit your business connections, I might add. Richard moved to the window, looking out at the moonlit garden below. The same garden where earlier that day he'd witnessed something that now seemed to symbolize a much deeper problem. When we married, you said you were excited to be Mason's stepmother. And I've done my duty, Vanessa replied, her voice cooling. I make sure he has everything he needs. The best tutors, the most advanced medical equipment, designer clothes. Things, Richard interrupted. You've given him things. But have you ever given him your time? Your attention? Your affection? The silence that followed was damning. Richard turned to face her, suddenly seeing his wife with new clarity. The carefully calculated expressions, the strategic charm that appeared when needed and vanished just as quickly. Do you even care about him at all? Richard asked, dreading the answer. Vanessa's perfectly composed facade cracked. Something cold and honest emerged in her eyes. What exactly do you want from me, Richard? To pretend? To manufacture maternal feelings for a child I never wanted? I married you, not your baggage. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and irretrievable. Baggage. Richard's voice was dangerously quiet. My son is baggage to you? Vanessa stood, tying her silk robe with sharp movements. You know what? I'm tired of pretending. You wanted truth. Here it is. I married you for your position, your wealth, your connections. The grieving widower with the crippled son wasn't part of my dream, but I accepted it as the cost of admission to the life I wanted. Each word landed like a physical blow. Richard stood stunned, not by the revelation itself. Some part of him had always suspected Vanessa's motivations weren't love, but by the casual cruelty in her tone. Don't look so shocked. Vanessa continued, gaining momentum. You didn't marry me for my deep intellect or shared values. You wanted arm candy, someone to host your business dinners and look good in photos. We both got what we wanted. No, Richard said, finding his voice. I wanted a mother for my son, a partner for myself. Vanessa laughed, the sound hollow and cutting. A mother, please. You wanted someone to handle the uncomfortable parts of raising a disabled child so you could focus on your precious company. Nancy does the actual caregiving while I play hostess for your business associates. Don't pretend this arrangement hasn't benefited you. Richard felt sick. Was there truth in her accusations? Had he chosen Vanessa partly because she seemed capable and detached, unlikely to demand the emotional presence he wasn't ready to give after Eleanor? I never asked you to be cold to him, Richard said finally, to make him feel unwelcome in his own home. I've given that boy more than most stepmothers would, Vanessa snapped. Do you know what my friends say? They think I'm a saint for taking on someone else's broken child, for enduring the stares when we go out, the special arrangements everything requires, the medical discussions that dominate every conversation. Get out, Richard said, the words escaping before he could consider them. Excuse me. Yes, get out of this room. I can't look at you right now. Vanessa's expression hardened. You're overreacting. We'll both calm down by morning and... I said get out. Richard's voice rose, a rare display of temper from a man known for his controlled demeanor. With a huff, Vanessa grabbed her phone and stalked toward the door. Fine, I'll sleep in the guest room. But Richard... Don't make decisions in anger that you'll regret when you remember how much you need me for the Hamilton merger next month." After she left, Richard sank onto the edge of the bed, head in his hands. The silence of the room pressed in around him, broken only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Eleanor's parents, who had embraced him like a son from the moment they met. Eleanor. What would she think of what he'd allowed to happen in their home? The thought brought a wave of shame so intense it was physically painful. Richard didn't sleep that night. He paced the floor of his bedroom, watching as the moon made its arc across the sky and early dawn light began to filter through the windows. As the first birds began to sing, he made a decision. At 6 in the morning, Richard knocked on Nancy's door in the staff wing. She answered almost immediately, already dressed in her usual neat attire despite the early hour. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, concern evident in her expression. "Is Mason all right?" "Mason is still sleeping," Richard assured her. "But I need to speak with you. May I come in?" Nancy's quarters were modest but homey, with framed photographs and handmade quilts adding warmth to the space. She gestured for him to sit at a small table by the window. "I'll make coffee," she offered, moving efficiently around the small kitchenette. "Thank you," Richard said, noticing a framed drawing on her wall, clearly Mason's work from a few years earlier. A colorful rendering of Nancy, himself and Mason, labeled "My Family" in a child's handwriting. Nancy set a steaming mug before him and took the seat across the table. Her expression was guarded but direct. "You've had a difficult night," she observed quietly. "I've had a long overdue realization," Richard corrected. "Nancy, I need you to tell me everything. About Vanessa and Mason. The truth, no matter how painful." Nancy's hands tightened around her mug. "Mr. Blackwood, I've always tried to remain professional and not overstep—" "Please," Richard interrupted. "I'm asking not as your employer, but as Mason's father. I've been blind and I need to understand what I've missed." The housekeeper's gaze was steady, assessing. Whatever she saw in his expression must have convinced her, because she nodded once decisively. "It started small," Nancy began, her voice low. "Comments when you weren't around. Suggestions that Mason was a burden, that his needs were excessive. She would cancel his physical therapy appointments if they interfered with her social calendar, claiming they could be rescheduled, even when his therapist emphasized consistency. Richard listened, each word adding to the weight in his chest. "She never physically harmed him," Nancy continued, seeing his expression. "But words leave different kinds of scars, Mr. Blackwood. When Mason would accomplish something in his therapy, she would diminish it. When he needed accommodations, she would make him feel like an inconvenience." "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. Nancy's gaze was unflinching. "I tried in my way." "But you were distant, focused on the company, and she is very careful around you. Very different when you're present." The truth of this observation stung. How much had he missed by burying himself in work after Eleanor's passing? How much had he failed to see because seeing would require feeling, and feeling had been too painful? "There's something else you should know," Nancy said after a moment. "Something I promised Mrs. Eleanor I would tell you if it ever became necessary." Richard went still. "Eleanor, what do you mean?" Nancy rose and went to a small writing desk in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer she removed an envelope. The paper yellowed with age. She placed it gently before him. "Before she passed, Mrs. Eleanor gave me this. She made me promise to keep it safe and give it to you if Mason ever needed more than what was immediately around him." Richard stared at the envelope. His name was written on the front in Eleanor's distinctive handwriting, the same handwriting that had penned love, notes in his briefcase and birthday cards that he kept in a box in his closet. "She knew she was leaving us," Nancy said softly, "and she wanted to make sure Mason would always have what he needed. Not just care, but love." With trembling fingers, Richard opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, dated 3 days before Eleanor's unexpected passing. "My dearest Richard," it began, "if you're reading this, it means our son needs something I can no longer provide. I've asked Nancy to keep this letter and give it to you only if Mason faces challenges that his current family structure cannot meet." As Richard read, tears blurred his vision. Eleanor's words reached across time, a final act of love and foresight from the woman who had always seen clearer than anyone. The letter spoke of her fears for Mason, her hopes, and finally, a revelation that shook Richard to his core. If you've remarried and Mason has not found the maternal love he deserves, there is someone who might help heal your family. Your brother, Thomas? Richard looked up sharply. My brother? But he moved away to live with your aunt when you were children, Nancy finished for him. That's what everyone was told. But Mrs. Eleanor discovered something different before she passed. Richard returned to the letter, his heart pounding. The truth, my love, is that Thomas was sent to Oak Ridge Home for Boys when he was 11. Your parents told you he went to live with your aunt because they were ashamed of his learning disabilities. They couldn't bear having a child who didn't fit their image of perfection. I found this out accidentally, through a former housekeeper of your parents who recognized our name in a charity publication. Thomas never went to your aunt's. He grew up in that institution alone. The world seemed to tilt around Richard. Thomas, his quiet, gentle younger brother who had struggled in school but could name every bird in the forest, who had been Richard's shadow until one day he simply wasn't there anymore. His parents had explained that Thomas needed special schooling, that Aunt Margaret could provide better care for his condition. It had been a lie. All of it. Mrs. Eleanor tried to find him, Nancy said quietly. Before her accident, she had hired a private investigator. The investigator found some information, but then, well, everything changed after the crash. Richard could barely process what he was hearing. His brother, abandoned by their parents, growing up in an institution while Richard enjoyed private schools and college, and went on to build his fortune. All because Thomas learned differently, processed the world in his own way. The letter contains the last known information about Thomas's whereabouts, Nancy added. Mrs. Eleanor believed that Mason might benefit from knowing his uncle. She thought Thomas might understand Mason in ways others couldn't. Richard folded the letter with care. Does Mason know about any of this? No, Nancy shook her head. Mrs. Eleanor wanted you to be the one to decide when and how to tell him. A strange calm settled over Richard. In the midst of discovering his marriage was a sham, and his parents had committed an unforgivable betrayal, he felt an odd clarity. A path forward. Nancy, he said, standing. Please pack bags for yourself and Mason. Enough for a week's trip. Nancy raised her eyebrows but asked no questions. When will you want to leave? Richard glanced at his watch. As soon as Mason wakes up. We're going to find my brother. As Nancy moved to comply, Richard added, and Nancy, thank you for everything you've done for my son, for being the one person in this house who truly saw him. The housekeeper paused at the door, her expression softening. He's easy to love, Mr. Blackwood. You just have to pay attention. It was perhaps the gentlest rebuke Richard had ever received, and the most deserved. As he left Nancy's quarters to return to the main house, Richard passed the hall mirror. The reflection that stared back at him was of a man he barely recognized, someone who had been sleepwalking through the most important parts of life while chasing success in all the wrong places. That would change today. By 9 o'clock that morning, Richard had made more decisions than he typically made in a week of board meetings. He'd called his executive team, delegating his responsibilities for the next 2 weeks. He'd contacted Mason's doctors to arrange for his medical needs during travel, and he'd avoided Vanessa, who had already left for her weekly tennis match, seemingly unaware that their late-night confrontation had fundamentally altered the course of their marriage. Mason sat in the kitchen, watching his father with curious eyes as Richard moved with uncharacteristic energy. Checking items off a hastily made list. Dad, what's going on? Mason finally asked. Nancy's packing our suitcases, and you cancelled your meeting with the Seattle investors. Are we going somewhere? Richard paused, realizing he'd been so caught up in logistics that he hadn't properly explained anything to his son. He pulled out a chair and sat across from Mason at the breakfast counter. We're going on a trip, Richard said, trying to find the right words. A kind of family quest. What kind of quest? Mason's interest was clearly piqued. He leaned forward in his wheelchair, the book he'd been reading forgotten beside his half-eaten toast. Richard took a deep breath. We're going to find someone I haven't seen in a very long time. My brother, your Uncle Thomas. Mason's eyes widened. You have a brother? I thought you were an only child. The innocent surprise in his son's voice made Richard wince. How much family history had he simply never shared? How many conversations had never happened, because he'd been too busy or too afraid of stirring up painful memories. I have a younger brother, Richard corrected himself. We were separated when we were boys, and I lost touch with him. It was a partial truth, the most he could manage until he understood the full story himself. The idea that his parents had institutionalized Thomas and lied about it was still too raw, too incomprehensible to articulate. Is that why we never visited Grandma and Grandpa, much before they passed? Mason asked, displaying the perceptiveness Richard often forgot he possessed. That's part of it, Richard admitted. My relationship with my parents was complicated. Like my relationship with Vanessa? Mason asked quietly. The simple question knocked the air from Richard's lungs. He reached across the counter to take his son's hand. Mason, about Vanessa, he began. It's okay, Dad, Mason interrupted, his voice small but steady. I know she doesn't really like me. I've known for a long time. It's not okay, Richard said firmly. Not at all. And I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Mason shrugged, attempting nonchalance, though his eyes revealed deeper hurt. Mom always said some people just aren't meant to fit together. Like puzzle pieces from different boxes. The casual wisdom, clearly passed down from Eleanor, struck Richard deeply. He'd married Vanessa knowing she was from an entirely different puzzle than their family, hoping somehow the pieces would mesh regardless. Your mom was right about a lot of things, Richard said softly. In fact, this trip was her idea in a way. She left a letter with Nancy, asking her to give it to me if you ever needed more than what we had here. Mason's eyes lit up at the mention of his mother. Mom knew about Uncle Thomas. She wanted us to find him. She discovered some things about him that I never knew, Richard explained. And she thought he might be someone important for you to know. Nancy entered the kitchen, her efficient movements pausing as she sensed the weight of their conversation. The bags are packed, Mr. Blackwood. I've included Mason's medication and equipment, and I've prepared a folder with all his medical information. Thank you. Nancy, Richard said, genuine gratitude in his voice. You're coming with us, of course. It wasn't a question, but Nancy nodded anyway. I wouldn't have it any other way. Where does Uncle Thomas live? Mason asked, excitement building in his voice. Is it far? Richard unfolded the letter he'd kept in his pocket. According to your mother's investigator, the last known address was in a small town called Pine Haven in Northern California. It's about a 7-hour drive from here. California? Mason's eyes widened. I've never been to California. The boyish enthusiasm made Richard smile, a genuine smile that felt foreign on his face after so long. Well, then we're overdue for a California adventure. As Nancy helped Mason get ready, Richard went to his study to handle one final piece of business before their departure. On his desk, he placed a sealed envelope addressed to Vanessa, containing a brief note explaining their absence and his intention to discuss the future of their marriage upon his return. It was more courtesy than she deserved after her revelations, but less final than what he was already considering. Next to it, he left instructions for his lawyer to begin quiet preparations for what might come next. The Hamilton merger could proceed without a perfect marriage as window dressing. Some business associates might gossip, but Richard found he cared far less about that prospect than he would have 24 hours ago. By 11, they were on the road. Richard drove the specially modified van they used for Mason's longer trips, with Nancy sitting beside Mason in the back. As Portland's familiar skyline receded in the rearview mirror, Richard felt a strange lightness. For the first time in years, he wasn't racing toward a business goal or obligation. He was simply following his heart, however uncertain the destination. Tell me about Uncle Thomas, Mason requested as they crossed the state line into California hours later. What's he like? Richard adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, memories flooding back. Thomas was different from other kids, quieter. He struggled in school, but he noticed things others missed. He could identify bird calls that I couldn't even hear, and he remembered every constellation in the night sky. He sounds cool, Mason said, and Richard felt a pang of regret for all the years his son could have known his uncle. He was gentle, Richard continued, surprised by how easily the memories returned now that he allowed them space. He collected feathers and interesting rocks. He would spend hours watching ants build their hills, completely fascinated. What happened to him? Mason asked, the innocent question landing heavily in the car. Richard met Nancy's eyes in the rearview mirror. finding silent support there. My parents told me he went to live with my aunt because she could better help with his learning. Difficulties, Richard said carefully. But I've recently learned that wasn't true. They sent him to a home for boys with special needs and they didn't keep in touch with him. Even this sanitized version of events felt painful to articulate. How could he explain to his son that his grandparents had essentially discarded their younger child for being different? That Richard himself had accepted their explanation without question, too absorbed in his own achievements to investigate further. That's awful, Mason said softly. He must have been so lonely. The simple observation, laden with empathy, reminded Richard so much of Eleanor that his throat tightened. Mason had inherited her emotional intelligence, her ability to cut through complications to the human core of any situation. Yes, Richard agreed. I think he probably was. Is that why we're going to find him now? Mason pressed. Because he was lonely? We're going to find him because families should be together, Richard said, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. Because I should have looked for him years ago. As the afternoon stretched into evening, they stopped at a roadside diner. Richard watched as Nancy expertly helped Mason navigate the cramped space, her movements so practiced they appeared effortless. The bond between them was evident in their easy communication, the gentle teasing, the way Nancy anticipated Mason's needs without making him feel dependent. It was what Richard had hoped Vanessa might develop with his son, this natural care that went beyond duty. Watching them now, he realized how foolish that hope had been. Such connections couldn't be manufactured or purchased, no matter how convenient that would be. After dinner, they checked into a small hotel just outside of Reading. As Nancy helped Mason get ready for bed in their adjoining room, Richard spread Eleanor's letter and the investigator's notes across his bed, studying them with fresh eyes. The report was 5 years old but detailed. Thomas Blackwood had been released from Oak Ridge Home at 18, had worked various jobs across the Pacific Northwest, and had eventually settled in Pine Haven, California, where he operated a small plant nursery. There was an address, a rural route outside the main town, and a business name, Blackwood Botanicals. Richard traced his finger over the name. His brother had kept their surname despite everything. What did that mean? Was it defiance? Reconciliation? Simply practicality? A soft knock at the connecting door interrupted his thoughts. Nancy entered at his invitation, closing the door quietly behind her. "Mason's asleep," she reported. "He was exhausted but excited. He made me promise to wake him early tomorrow." Richard smiled, gathering the papers into a neat pile. "Thank you for coming with us, Nancy. I don't think I could do this without you." Nancy sat in the armchair by the window, her usual formality softened by the circumstances. "Mrs. Eleanor would be proud of you for making this journey." "Would she?" Richard asked, genuine uncertainty in his voice. "I should have done this years ago, when she first discovered the truth about Thomas." "You weren't ready then," Nancy said simply. "Grief has its own timeline, Mr. Blackwood. After Mrs. Eleanor passed, you could barely look at Mason without pain. Taking on another family connection would have been impossible." The gentle assessment was accurate, but still difficult to hear. Richard had been a coward, burying himself in work rather than facing the emotional needs of his son, or himself. "Do you think Thomas will want to see us?" Richard asked, voicing the fear that had been growing as they drew closer to their destination. Nancy considered the question thoughtfully. "I can't know that, but I believe in giving people the chance to decide for themselves. You're offering him that choice at least. And if he turns us away, then you'll know you tried," Nancy replied. "And Mason will have learned that relationships are worth the risk, even when they're difficult." Richard nodded, absorbing the wisdom in her words. "You've been the constant in Mason's life, more than me in many ways. Children need different things from different people," Nancy said diplomatically. "I could never give Mason what he gets from you, even if I see him more hours of the day." "And what's that?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "A sense of his place in the world," Nancy answered without hesitation. "His identity. When he watches you solve problems, make decisions, stand your ground, he's learning who he is and who he might become." The observation surprised Richard. He'd always assumed his absences were simply deficits in Mason's life, not recognizing that even his limited presence carried meaning. "Get some rest." "Mr. Blackwood," Nancy advised, rising from the chair, "tomorrow will bring its own challenges." After she left, Richard stood at the window looking out at the unfamiliar town below. Somewhere less than 100 miles from where he stood, his brother was living a life Richard knew nothing about. A life that might have been radically different if Richard, had questioned their parents' story years ago. The weight of that realization was heavy, but for the first time in years Richard felt truly awake. Tomorrow would indeed bring challenges, but also perhaps the beginning of healing for wounds he hadn't even known existed. As he finally lay down to sleep, Richard found himself whispering into the darkness, "We're coming, Thomas. If you'll have us, we're coming home." Pinehaven revealed itself gradually as they drove along winding roads flanked by towering redwoods. The small town emerged from the forest like an afterthought, a collection of weathered buildings with hand-painted signs and porch swings, the kind of place where progress arrived slowly and was carefully considered before being accepted. "It's beautiful," Mason breathed, his face pressed against the window. "Like something from one of Mom's storybooks," Richard silently agreed. The town had a timeless quality that stood in stark contrast to Portland's constant evolution. He could imagine Thomas finding peace here, among people who valued permanence. Following the investigator's notes, Richard turned onto a narrow dirt road leading away from the town center. They passed small homesteads nestled among the trees, each one set far enough from its neighbors to ensure privacy without complete isolation. "The report says Blackwood Botanicals should be about 3 miles down this road," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. "There." Mason pointed to a wooden sign ahead, carved with the words Blackwood Botanicals and decorated with a simple leaf design. Below it, smaller lettering read, "Specialty Plants and Native Species." Richard turned onto the gravel driveway, the van moving slowly past wild gardens that appeared both carefully tended and deliberately natural. Unlike the manicured precision of his own estate, these gardens followed the contours of the land, working with nature rather than imposing order upon it. The driveway opened to a clearing where a modest cabin stood alongside several large greenhouses. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled patterns across the weathered wood siding. Their small pickup truck was parked near one of the greenhouses, its bed filled with potted plants. Richard brought the van to a stop and cut the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming. "We're here," he said unnecessarily, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. Nancy gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Would you like me to go first?" "To explain who we are?" Richard shook his head. "No, this is something I need to do myself." With deliberate movements, Richard exited the van and walked around to help Nancy with Mason's wheelchair. The familiar routine, unfolding the ramp, securing the chair, checking the brakes, gave him a moment to gather his composure. As they approached the cabin, the door to one of the greenhouses opened. A man emerged, carrying a tray of seedlings, his attention focused on the delicate plants. He was of medium height with salt and pepper hair that curled slightly at his collar, dressed in faded jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Richard stopped in his tracks. Despite the 27 years that had passed, he would have recognized his brother anywhere. Thomas had their father's build and their mother's expressive features, though time and experience had etched lines of their own. "Thomas," Richard called, his voice barely carrying across the yard. The man looked up, his movement stilling. He carefully set down the tray of seedlings on a nearby table before straightening to face them. His expression was guarded but not unwelcoming. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his voice deeper than Richard remembered but with the same gentle cadence. Richard took a step forward. "Thomas, it's me, Richard, your brother." The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Thomas's face remained perfectly still, but his eyes, the same deep blue as Richard's own, widened slightly. The only indication of his shock. "Richard," he finally said, not a question but an acknowledgement. His gaze moved to Mason and Nancy, curiosity replacing some of the wariness. "It's been a long time." 27 years, Richard confirmed. I only recently learned the truth about what happened. About Oak Ridge." Thomas's expression flickered, a complicated emotion crossing his features too quickly to interpret. "I see," he said simply. Then, after another pause, "Would you like to come inside?" I was about to make some tea. The invitation, so ordinary in the face of their extraordinary reunion, felt like both a reprieve and a gift. Richard nodded, relief washing through him. At least Thomas hadn't turned them away immediately. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly spacious, with large windows that invited the forest inside. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on botany, native ecosystems, and regional history. Plants occupied nearly every surface, from tiny succulents to trailing vines that framed the windows. "It's like being in a fairy tale house," Mason whispered to Nancy, who smiled in agreement. Thomas moved easily around the open-plan space, putting a kettle on the wood stove and gathering mugs from open shelving. His movements were methodical, almost meditative. "This is my son Mason," Richard said, breaking the silence. "And this is Nancy Miller, who has been with our family since Mason was born." Thomas nodded politely to both of them. "It's nice to meet you," he said, his genuine warmth more evident when addressing Mason than when he'd acknowledged Richard. "I don't get many young visitors out here." "You have a great place," Mason said enthusiastically. "Those greenhouses look amazing. What do you grow in them?" A smile softened Thomas's features, transforming him from a cautious stranger into someone Richard could recognize from childhood. "All sorts of things. One is for native plants that I'm helping to propagate for restoration projects. Another is for medicinal herbs and endangered species. The third is my experiment space, plants that aren't supposed to grow in this climate, but I'm stubborn." "Can I see them?" Mason asked eagerly, then caught himself. "I mean, if that's okay. Dad says I should ask before exploring people's spaces." Thomas's smile widened. "Your dad is right about that. But yes, I'd be happy to show you after we have some tea." The kettle whistled, and Thomas poured hot water into a teapot, the scent of herbs filling the cabin. He served the tea in mismatched mugs, each one seemingly chosen for character rather than coordination. "It's a blend of lemon balm, mint, and a few other things from the garden," Thomas explained as he handed Mason his mug. "Nothing fancy, but good for clearing the mind." As they settled with their tea, the initial awkwardness returned. Richard searched for words that could possibly bridge nearly 3 decades of separation. "You kept the family name," he said finally. "For your business." Thomas nodded, absently tracing the rim of his mug with one finger. "Names have power. I decided long ago not to give up anything that was rightfully mine, including my name." The simple statement carried layers of meaning that Richard felt rather than fully understood. A quiet dignity in the face of rejection. "I didn't know," Richard said, the inadequacy of the words painful. "About Oak Ridge. About what our parents did." "They told me you went to live with Aunt Margaret." "I figured as much," Thomas replied evenly. "They were very concerned with appearances, our parents. The story of a beloved aunt taking in a challenging child probably sounded much better at their country club than the truth." There was remarkably little bitterness in his tone, just a factual assessment that made Richard's own anger seem suddenly outsized and inappropriate. "When did you find out?" Thomas asked. "That they lied?" "Yesterday," Richard admitted. "My late wife, Eleanor, discovered the truth 5 years ago. She left a letter with Nancy to be given to me if circumstances warranted it." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "And what circumstances finally brought you to my doorstep after all this time?" Richard glanced at Mason, uncertain how much to share in front of his son. Nancy, sensing his hesitation, gently touched Mason's shoulder. "Mason, why don't we step outside for a moment? I noticed some interesting birds by the garden that I'd like to identify." Mason looked between the adults, clearly aware that they wanted privacy, but too well-mannered to protest. "Okay," he agreed, allowing Nancy to wheel him onto the porch. When they were alone, Richard turned back to his brother. "My current wife, Vanessa. It's become clear that she married me for my money and position. She has no love for Mason, and I've been blind to how she's treated him." "Ah," Thomas said softly. History does have a way of repeating itself. The parallel wasn't lost on Richard, a child rejected for being different, a parent too absorbed in other concerns to notice. Shame washed over him. "I'm trying to break that pattern," Richard said. "Eleanor's letter suggested that you might be important in Mason's life, that you might understand him in ways others couldn't." Thomas studied Richard thoughtfully. Your son seems like a remarkable young man, from the little I've seen. But I'm curious why Eleanor would think I'd have special insight. Mason was in an accident 5 years ago, Richard explained. The crash that took Eleanor's life. He suffered a spinal injury that left him unable to walk. Since then, he's struggled to find his place. He's brilliant and creative, but society doesn't always see past the wheelchair. Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes. And your wife doesn't see him at all? No, Richard confirmed. She doesn't. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, gazing out the window to where Mason and Nancy were examining something in the garden. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Oakridge wasn't as bad as it could have been. Some of the staff were kind. There was a groundskeeper, Mr. Finley, who let me help in the gardens. That's where I learned about plants, how resilient they can be, even in harsh conditions, how they adapt and find ways to thrive. He turned back to Richard, his expression open now. I don't harbor resentment toward you, if that's what you're worried about. We were both children. You couldn't have changed what our parents decided. I could have looked for you later, Richard countered. When I was an adult. When I had resources. Perhaps, Thomas acknowledged. But you had your own life to build. And I've done all right with mine. He gestured around the cabin. It's not an empire like Blackwood Manufacturing, but it's mine. I created it from nothing. There was quiet pride in his voice, not defensiveness. Richard felt a sudden, sharp admiration for his brother's self-sufficiency. I'd like Mason to know you, Richard said simply. If you're willing, we can stay in town for a few days. Visit at whatever pace feels comfortable for you. Thomas considered this, his gaze drifting again to the window where Mason was now examining a flowering shrub. His expression alight with interest. He likes plants, Thomas observed. He likes learning, Richard corrected gently. He's curious about everything. Before the accident, he couldn't sit still, always climbing, exploring, asking questions. Afterward, he channeled all that energy into reading, into understanding the world through books, since he couldn't explore it as freely with his body. Thomas nodded, something like recognition in his eyes. I was similar as a child. Too many questions, too much energy directed at things our parents considered unimportant. It wasn't valued in the Blackwood household. No, Richard agreed, it wasn't. A silence fell between them, but it was different now, contemplative rather than uncomfortable. Thomas seemed to come to a decision. I was planning to collect seed from a stand of rare trillium this afternoon, he said. It's in a meadow not far from here, accessible by a dirt road. If Mason would like to join me, he'd be welcome. You too, he added, almost as an afterthought. Richard recognized the offer for what it was, not full reconciliation, but an opening, a chance to begin building something new. He'd love that, Richard said sincerely. And we both would. When they called Mason and Nancy back inside and extended the invitation, Mason's face lit up with genuine excitement. Real botanical fieldwork? Absolutely. Thomas smiled at his enthusiasm. It's not very glamorous. Mostly counting plants and collecting seed heads in labeled bags. But it's important work. These particular trillium are becoming rare due to climate change and habitat loss. I've read about trillium, Mason said eagerly. They're spring ephemeral perennials with 3 petals and 3 sepals, and they rely on ants to disperse their seeds because they have eleosomes, fatty structures that ants like to eat. Thomas looked impressed. That's exactly right. Not many people know about eleosomes. Mason beamed at the recognition. I read a lot about ecosystems and plant adaptations. It's fascinating how they solve problems without being able to move. Richard watched the interaction with a warm sense of wonder. In just minutes, his brother and son had found common ground, speaking a shared language of scientific curiosity that transcended the awkwardness of their situation. As Thomas began gathering supplies for their fieldwork expedition, Richard stepped outside onto the porch, needing a moment to process the morning's events. Nancy joined him, her quiet presence steadying as always. He seems like a good man, she observed. Steady, self-contained. Yes, Richard agreed. He's built a life here. A meaningful one. Mrs. Eleanor would be pleased, Nancy said softly, to see them connecting. Richard nodded, a lump forming in his throat. She always saw what was needed, even before the need was apparent. Inside the cabin, they could hear Mason's eager questions and Thomas's patient answers, the cadence of their conversation already developing its own rhythm. It was just a beginning, fragile and uncertain, but it held promise. As they prepared to leave for the meadow, Richard noticed Thomas slip something into the backpack he was bringing along, a faded photograph in a simple frame. Though he couldn't see the image clearly, Richard suspected he knew what it was. The last picture of the two brothers together before their separation, a moment frozen in time before everything changed. It seemed Thomas had not forgotten either, despite the purposeful life he'd built in the aftermath of their family's fracture. For the first time since reading Eleanor's letter, Richard felt something close to hope. Not just for Mason, but for himself. For the possibility that some broken things could, with care and attention, be made whole again, different than before, but perhaps stronger in the mended places. The meadow stretched before them like a living tapestry, dotted with wildflowers and framed by ancient redwoods. Thomas's truck bumped along the narrow dirt road. Mason securely buckled in the extended cab, while Richard and Nancy followed behind in the van. As they reached a small clearing, Thomas parked and came around to help with Mason's wheelchair. "The terrain gets rough beyond this point," he explained, "but I prepared something that might help." From the truck bed, Thomas unfolded what looked like a modified beach wagon with oversized, rugged wheels. "I built this for a botanist friend who studies alpine meadows. It's designed for rough terrain." Richard watched, impressed, as Thomas and Nancy helped transfer Mason into the wagon. The boy's face lit up with excitement as Thomas secured him with padded straps. "This is awesome," Mason exclaimed. "I haven't been off-trail in ages." "It's not perfect," Thomas cautioned, "but it should get you closer to the action than staying in the van." As they ventured deeper into the meadow, Thomas pointed out various plant species, his knowledge flowing naturally. Mason absorbed every word, occasionally surprising Thomas with his own insights. "That's wild ginger," Mason identified, pointing to a plant with heart-shaped leaves. "The flowers grow at ground level so ants can pollinate them, right?" Thomas nodded, clearly pleased. "Exactly right. Many people walk right past without noticing the flowers. You have to know to look down." "That's often true," Richard observed quietly. "The most important things are easily missed if you're not paying attention." Thomas glanced at him, something unspoken passing between the brothers, before he continued leading them toward the Trillium stand. The terrain grew increasingly challenging, but Thomas navigated it expertly, pulling Mason's wagon with surprising strength. When they reached the heart of the meadow, Thomas stopped. "So here we are," he announced, "one of the last healthy populations of Trillium rival in this part of California." Mason gasped with delight at the sight of the delicate white flowers nodding in the gentle breeze. "They're beautiful." "They're also vulnerable," Thomas explained, kneeling beside a plant. "Climate change has disrupted their bloom times, and invasive species compete for resources. That's why we're collecting seeds for conservation and potential reintroduction." For the next hour, they worked together as Thomas taught them how to identify mature seed pods, collect them without damaging the plants, and document their locations. Mason proved to be particularly adept, his eye for detail allowing him to spot plants that even Thomas occasionally missed. "You've got a natural talent for this," Thomas told Mason, genuine admiration in his voice. "Most people need years of training to develop that kind of observational skill." Mason beamed under the praise. Richard felt a surge of gratitude toward his brother for seeing his son so clearly, for recognizing abilities rather than limitations. As the afternoon wore on, Nancy spread a blanket for a picnic lunch she'd prepared. The four of them sat in comfortable companionship, the initial awkwardness of their meeting gradually fading. "Have you always worked with plants?" Mason asked Thomas between bites of sandwich. Thomas considered the question. "Not professionally, not at first. After Oak Ridge, I worked all kinds of jobs, dishwasher, night watchman, janitor, places that didn't require much formal education. But I always grew things wherever I lived, even if it was just herbs in a window box." "What changed?" Richard asked, genuinely curious about the path his brother's life had taken. "About 15 years ago, I was working maintenance at a botanical garden in Oregon," Thomas explained. "The head botanist noticed I had knowledge about native plants that wasn't in any of their textbooks, things I'd learned from observation and from elders in the local indigenous community who'd taken me under their wing." He encouraged me to document what I knew. That became your career? Nancy asked. Thomas nodded. Eventually, I started consulting on restoration projects, then selling specialized native plants to conservation organizations. 8 years ago, I saved enough to buy this land and start Blackwood Botanicals. There was quiet pride in his voice, not boastful but satisfied. Richard felt a pang of something like envy, not for the modest business itself, but for the evident fulfillment it brought his brother. "Do you like it?" Mason asked. "Running your own business?" "Most days," Thomas replied with a smile. "The paperwork can be tedious, but being able to make my own decisions, set my own priorities, that freedom is worth any amount of hard work." Richard recognized the entrepreneurial spirit they shared, despite their vastly different paths. "Freedom to choose is powerful," he agreed. "I built Blackwood Manufacturing for similar reasons, though on a different scale." "I followed your career in the business pages," Thomas admitted, surprising Richard. "You've done well." Dad would have been proud. The mention of their father hung in the air between them. Richard struggled to find a response that acknowledged the complicated truth of their shared history. "He valued certain kinds of success," Richard said carefully. "But I think now that his metrics were limited." Thomas nodded, accepting this diplomatic assessment. "And your son? What kind of success do you wish for him?" The question caught Richard off guard. He glanced at Mason, who was listening intently, waiting for his father's answer. "Happiness," Richard said finally. "Connection. Purpose. The specifics are for Mason to determine." Something softened in Thomas's expression. "That's a wiser answer than I expected." "I'm learning," Richard said simply. As they packed up from lunch, Mason asked if he could continue helping Thomas collect seeds rather than return to the van. Thomas readily agreed, and they spent another hour working together. Their heads bent close in consultation, hands carefully gathering the future of an endangered species. Richard watched them from a slight distance, struck by the easy rapport they'd developed in just a day. Nancy joined him, following his gaze. "They're alike," she observed quietly. "In the ways that matter." "Yes," Richard agreed. Eleanor saw it somehow, even without meeting Thomas. She knew Mason would need someone who understood his perspective. "Mrs. Eleanor had remarkable intuition," Nancy said. "She saw beyond surfaces." As the afternoon light began to fade, they reluctantly packed up their collection materials. Mason's enthusiasm remained undimmed despite his obvious fatigue. "Can we come back tomorrow?" he asked Thomas eagerly. "You mentioned there were other endangered plants in the area." Thomas glanced at Richard, seeking permission. "If your father doesn't mind extending your stay." "We're here for as long as needed," Richard confirmed. No rush to return home. The drive back to Thomas's property was filled with animated conversation between Mason and Thomas, discussing the day's findings and plans for further exploration. When they arrived at the cabin, Thomas surprised them with an invitation. "I have a guest cabin a little ways down the path," he offered. "Nothing fancy, but it has 2 bedrooms and basic amenities. You're welcome to stay there instead of driving back to town each day." The invitation clearly delighted Mason. Richard recognized it for what it was, not just hospitality, but a tentative opening of Thomas's carefully constructed life to include them. "We'd like that very much," Richard accepted. "Thank you." As they settled into the rustic but comfortable guest cabin that evening, Mason was too excited to sleep, despite his physical exhaustion. "Uncle Thomas knows so much." "Dad," he marveled as Richard helped him into bed. "Not just facts from books, but real knowledge from experience. And he doesn't treat me like I'm broken or strange or a burden." The last word hung painfully in the air. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, his heart aching with the realization of how deeply Vanessa's attitude had affected his son. "You are not a burden, Mason," he said firmly. "You never have been and never will be. I'm sorry if I ever made you feel that way." Mason shook his head. "You didn't. But Vanessa—" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing his stepmother. "You can tell me," Richard encouraged gently. "I need to know." Mason's fingers twisted in the bedspread. "She says things when you're not around. That I make everything harder. That people only include me because they pity me. That you'd have a better life if you didn't have to worry about my special needs." Each word felt like a knife to Richard's heart. He'd suspected Vanessa's cruelty, but hearing the specific barb she'd aimed at his son's self-worth filled him with cold fury. "None of that is true," Richard said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "You are the greatest gift in my life, Mason, never doubt that." Mason studied his father's face, seeming to search for the truth in his words. Whatever he saw must have reassured him, because he nodded slowly. "I like it here," he said, changing the subject. "With Uncle Thomas. I feel normal." "We'll stay as long as you'd like," Richard promised. After Mason finally drifted off to sleep, Richard stepped outside onto the small porch of the guest cabin. The night was clear, stars visible through gaps in the towering trees. The peaceful setting stood in stark contrast to the turmoil within him. The sound of footsteps on the path drew his attention. Thomas approached, carrying a bottle and 2 glasses. "Thought you might want some company," his brother offered. "Nancy mentioned you don't sleep well these days." Richard accepted the glass Thomas poured. "She knows me better than I know myself sometimes." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the forest sounds creating a gentle backdrop to their thoughts. "Your son is remarkable," Thomas said finally. "Observant, thoughtful, resilient." "He is," Richard agreed, "though I can't take much credit for those qualities. That's all Eleanor and, frankly, Nancy." "Don't sell yourself short," Thomas countered. "Children absorb more than we realize, even when we're not consciously teaching." Richard considered this. "Like how we both absorbed our father's drive despite taking such different paths with it." Thomas nodded. "And mother's attention to detail, though we apply it differently." "I've missed knowing you," Richard admitted suddenly, "even before I knew I should have been missing you." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "I used to be angry," he finally said. "Not just at our parents, but at you too, for not looking for me, for believing their lies so easily." The honesty was painful but necessary. Richard didn't try to defend himself. "But anger takes energy," Thomas continued, "and eventually I needed that energy for building my own life. So I let it go. Not completely, not all at once, but gradually. I don't know if I could have done the same in your position," Richard said honestly. Thomas shrugged. "We do what we must to survive. And then, if we're lucky, we find ways to thrive despite it all." As they sat together under the stars, Richard felt a tentative bridge forming between his present and his past. A connection that might, with care and attention, grow strong enough to support a future he hadn't imagined possible just days ago. "What are your plans?" Thomas asked eventually. "Regarding your wife, I mean." Richard swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I'm not sure yet, but I know I can't go back to how things were. Mason deserves better. We both do." "And what would better look like?" Thomas pressed gently. Richard considered the question. "Honesty, acceptance, a home where no one has to pretend or hide parts of themselves, where differences are valued rather than merely tolerated." "Sounds like you do know what you want," Thomas observed. "The question is just how to get there." As if summoned by their conversation, Richard's phone buzzed with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen and felt his stomach tighten. Vanessa. "Speaking of complications," he murmured, showing Thomas the screen before declining the call. "You'll have to face it eventually," Thomas pointed out. "I know," Richard agreed. "But not tonight. Tonight is for reconnection, not confrontation." Thomas raised his glass in acknowledgement. "To reconnection, then, and to the surprising paths that lead us home." The brothers touched glasses, the sound ringing clear in the night air. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Richard knew with sudden clarity that they would face them changed by this unexpected reunion. Stronger, perhaps, than either would have been alone. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt both new and somehow familiar, as if they were remembering rather than creating a family dynamic. Each morning, Thomas would arrive at the guest cabin with fresh coffee and ideas for the day's activities. Mason eagerly anticipated these visits, his face lighting up at the sound of his uncle's footsteps on the porch. Together, they explored Thomas's world, collecting specimens in the forest, learning propagation techniques in the greenhouses, identifying birds by their calls. Richard observed the growing bond between his son and brother with a mixture of gratitude and something like wonder. On their 4th morning in Pine Haven, Mason approached his father with an idea that had clearly been forming in his mind. "Dad," he began, his expression earnest, Remember how you've been talking about expanding the Blackwood Foundation's community projects? Richard nodded. The philanthropic arm of his company had always been important to him, though he'd admittedly delegated much of its operation to others in recent years. What if we created a special school? Mason continued excitedly, for kids who learn differently or have physical challenges, somewhere that combines nature and traditional learning. Like what Uncle Thomas does, but for education. The idea caught Richard by surprise, not because it was impractical, but because it was so perfectly aligned with values he'd always claimed to hold, but had rarely prioritized. That's actually quite brilliant, Richard acknowledged. What gave you the idea? Mason gestured toward the window, where they could see Thomas working in one of his greenhouses. Uncle Thomas showed me his sensory garden yesterday, the one designed for people with visual impairments. The plants are arranged by texture and scent, rather than just appearance. It made me think about how different people need different approaches, but that doesn't make any approach less valid. Richard felt a surge of pride at his son's insight. Would you want to present this idea to Thomas? See what he thinks? Mason nodded eagerly. Can we tell him today? I've been making notes about how it could work. True to his word, Mason had filled several pages in his notebook with surprisingly detailed thoughts on curriculum, accessibility features, and potential locations. Richard was struck by how thoroughly his son had considered the concept. That afternoon, as they shared lunch in Thomas's garden, Mason presented his idea. Thomas listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was taking the proposal seriously. So the core concept, Thomas summarized, is a school that integrates hands-on nature experiences with academic learning, designed to accommodate different learning styles and physical abilities from the ground up. Exactly, Mason confirmed. So not just accommodations added onto a traditional structure, but a whole new approach that recognizes diversity from the beginning. Thomas glanced at Richard. This is a significant undertaking, both financially and logistically. The Blackwood Foundation has the resources, Richard said without hesitation. What we've lacked is the right vision. I think Mason might have just provided that. Thomas considered this, his expression thoughtful. I'm not an educator. My expertise is limited to plants and conservation. But you understand how different minds work, Mason countered, and how important it is to feel valued for who you actually are, not who others think you should be. The simple observation clearly resonated with Thomas. He nodded slowly. I suppose I do have some experience with that. We would need educational experts, of course, Richard added, already thinking practically, but having someone who intuitively understands the mission would be invaluable. Are you offering me a job, big brother? Thomas asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Richard smiled. More like a partnership, if you're interested. Before Thomas could respond, Richard's phone rang again. Vanessa's name flashed on the screen for the 5th time that day. With a sigh, he declined the call. You can't avoid her forever, Nancy pointed out gently. I know, Richard acknowledged, but I'd rather have this conversation in person when we return. As if on cue, his phone chimed with a text message. Richard read it and felt his stomach drop. What is it? Mason asked, noticing his father's expression. Richard hesitated, but then decided honesty was the better approach. Vanessa is on her way here. Apparently she tracked my phone's location. Mason's face fell. Here, why? She doesn't even like nature. Probably because I haven't been responding to her calls, Richard admitted, and because she doesn't like losing control of situations. Thomas raised an eyebrow. When should we expect this delightful visit? According to her text, she left Portland yesterday evening, Richard calculated. So possibly by this afternoon. Nancy quietly stood. I'll prepare the guest cabin for another visitor, though I suspect she won't be pleased with the accommodations. You don't need to do that, Nancy, Richard said quickly. She can stay in town if she insists on coming all this way. We should at least be prepared, Nancy replied diplomatically, though her feelings about Vanessa were clear in her tone. As Nancy left to tidy the cabin, Mason turned to his father with worry evident in his expression. Does this mean we have to go back home? No, Richard said firmly. We'll stay as long as you'd like. Vanessa doesn't make those decisions. Mason nodded, though he seemed unconvinced. Richard felt a surge of protectiveness, His son should never have to question his place or priority in his own family. Why don't you and Thomas continue working on your plant identification project? Richard suggested. I'll handle Vanessa when she arrives. As Mason and Thomas headed to the greenhouse, Richard found himself alone in the garden, steeling himself for the confrontation to come. He hadn't intended to have this conversation in Pinehaven, but perhaps there was something appropriate about facing the truth in this place of natural honesty. Thomas approached him a short while later, concern evident in his expression. Mason's helping Nancy prepare lunch. I thought you might want to talk before your wife arrives. Richard nodded gratefully. I should have ended the marriage before leaving Portland. It wasn't fair to bring this situation to your doorstep. Life rarely unfolds in the neat sequence we'd prefer, Thomas observed. What are you planning to tell her? The truth, Richard said simply. That I know she married me for my position and wealth. That I know how she's treated Mason. That our marriage is over. And if she fights you on it? Thomas asked. From what you've said, she values the lifestyle you provide. Richard's expression hardened. She can have a generous financial settlement. What she can't have is continued access to Mason or control over our lives. Thomas studied his brother thoughtfully. You're different from the boy I remember. He tended to avoid confrontation at all costs. I've spent too many years avoiding difficult truths, Richard admitted. It's time that changed. The sound of tires on gravel announced Vanessa's arrival before they saw her sleek white Mercedes coming up the drive. Richard took a deep breath and walked toward the front of the property to meet her. Vanessa emerged from her car like a visitor from another world, designer sunglasses, perfectly styled hair, and a cream-colored pantsuit that seemed ludicrously out of place among the redwoods and wildflowers. Richard, she said coolly, would you care to explain why I had to track my husband's location like some suspicious wife in a television drama? Hello, Vanessa, Richard replied evenly. I was planning to call you once we'd returned to Portland. Her gaze swept dismissively over the property. And when exactly would that be? You've been ignoring my calls for days while hiding out in. She gestured vaguely at the surroundings, whatever this rustic situation is. This is my brother's home, Richard explained, watching her expression shift from disdain to surprise. Your brother? The one you never mention? Vanessa removed her sunglasses, suddenly more interested. Why the sudden family reunion? Richard chose his words carefully. I recently learned some truths about my family history that made reconnecting with Thomas a priority. In the middle of the Hamilton merger negotiations, Vanessa challenged. The board called me, Richard. They're concerned about your sudden disappearance. I've been in regular contact with the executive team, Richard countered. The merger is proceeding as planned. Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice though no one else was within earshot. This isn't like you, Richard. Abandoning your responsibilities, ignoring my calls, taking Mason on some wilderness excursion without proper medical supervision. Nancy is with us, Richard pointed out, and Mason has had excellent medical care his entire life. A few days experiencing nature won't harm him. That's not for you to decide unilaterally, Vanessa snapped. I'm his stepmother. I have a say in these matters. Richard felt a surge of anger at her presumption. A stepmother who refers to him as baggage, who tells him he's a burden when I'm not around to hear it. I don't think you've earned the right to any say in his life, Vanessa. Her expression froze, then quickly rearranged itself into practiced contrition. You misunderstood what I said that night, Richard. I was upset, tired. Stop, Richard interrupted. I'm not interested in the performance. I've seen enough of it over the past 3 years. Before Vanessa could respond, Thomas approached from the cabin. Lunch is ready, he announced calmly. Nancy suggested you might both want to continue this conversation in private. Vanessa turned her attention to Thomas, assessing him with the calculating gaze Richard had once mistaken for perceptiveness. You must be the long-lost brother, she said with a brittle smile. How fortunate that Richard found you just when he was having a midlife crisis. If the barb affected Thomas, he didn't show it. It's interesting that you interpret family reconciliation as a crisis, he observed mildly. That says more about your values than Richard's. Vanessa's smile tightened. And I suppose you've been filling his head with ideas about what our marriage should be. Actually, Thomas replied, I've mostly been teaching his son about native plant species. Far more interesting than your marital dynamics, I assure you. Richard intervened before Vanessa could respond. Thomas, would you give us a moment? I need to speak with Vanessa alone. Thomas nodded and returned to the cabin, leaving Richard and Vanessa standing amid the wildflowers that seemed to mockingly frame their conflict with natural beauty. I want a divorce, Richard said simply, seeing no reason to delay the inevitable. Vanessa laughed, though the sound held no humor. Because I was honest about my feelings. Many marriages are built on practical considerations, Richard. You knew I wasn't some love-struck ingénue when you married me. This isn't about us, Richard clarified. It's about how you've treated Mason. I've provided him with everything a child could want, Vanessa countered defensively, except acceptance, kindness, basic human dignity. Vanessa's facade finally cracked, frustration bleeding through. What did you expect, Richard? That I would magically become maternal toward a child who isn't mine, who requires constant special attention and accommodation, who reminds you constantly of your precious first wife? I expected basic decency, Richard replied, his voice hardening. I expected you to try at minimum. Instead, you've actively undermined his confidence, made him feel unwelcome in his own home, treated him like an inconvenience. Vanessa crossed her arms. You can't prove any of that. It's his word against mine, and children often misinterpret adult interactions. Actually, Richard countered, Nancy has documented your behavior for years, out of concern for Mason's well-being. This wasn't strictly true. Nancy hadn't mentioned documentation, but the sudden flicker of alarm in Vanessa's eyes suggested there was indeed behavior worth documenting. I won't be vilified for not being the perfect stepmother, Vanessa declared, regaining her composure. If you want a divorce, fine, but I won't leave empty-handed, Richard. The prenuptial agreement has clear provisions for my comfort. You'll receive exactly what the agreement stipulates, Richard confirmed. Nothing more, nothing less. My lawyers will be in touch when we return to Portland. And what about now? Vanessa demanded. You expect me to drive all the way back alone? Richard considered the options. Having Vanessa stay in Pinehaven would disrupt the peaceful dynamic they'd established, but sending her away immediately seemed unnecessarily harsh. You're welcome to stay in town tonight, he offered. There's a decent hotel on Main Street, but we won't be returning with you tomorrow. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. And the Hamilton merger dinner next week? The board expects us both to attend. I'll be there, Richard assured her. You won't. Our public appearances as a couple are over, Vanessa. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be. For a moment, something like genuine emotion flashed across Vanessa's face. Not sadness for the end of their marriage, but fear perhaps of the uncertain future ahead. You'll regret this, she said finally, throwing away a perfectly functional marriage because your crippled son told some tales. The casual cruelty of the words confirmed everything Richard needed to know. No, Vanessa, my only regret is not seeing the truth sooner. Mason deserved better than what I gave him by bringing you into our lives. Without another word, Vanessa returned to her car, reversing down the driveway with more speed than was prudent on the rough terrain. Richard watched her go, feeling a complex mixture of relief and regret, not for the end of their marriage, but for the pain his poor judgment had caused his son. When he returned to the cabin, Mason was waiting anxiously at the table, his food untouched. Is she gone? He asked quietly. Yes, Richard confirmed, taking a seat beside him. She's gone, and she won't be coming back. Does that mean? Mason let the question hang unfinished. It means I've told her I want a divorce, Richard said gently, and that our priority now is creating a home where you feel completely safe and valued. Mason nodded, relief evident in the relaxing of his shoulders. I heard some of what she said. About me being Don't, Richard interrupted firmly. Don't repeat her words, they have no place in our family. From across the table, Thomas spoke up. Your father's right, Mason. Some people view differences as deficiencies because their own perspective is limited. That's about their limitations, not yours. Nancy placed a supportive hand on Mason's shoulder. Besides, I happen to know that your mother would be enormously proud of the young man you're becoming, of your compassion, your intelligence, your resilience. Mason blinked rapidly, emotion evident in his eyes. You think so? I know so, Nancy assured him. She used to say you had the most beautiful heart she'd ever known. That hasn't changed. As they resumed their meal, the conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics. Thomas's plans for a new greenhouse, Mason's ideas for the school concept, Richard's thoughts on how the Blackwood Foundation could support the initiative. The shadow of Vanessa's visit slowly receded, though Richard knew the wounds of her presence in their lives would take longer to heal. Later that evening, as Mason and Nancy played a board game by the fireplace, Richard stepped outside for some air. He found Thomas sitting on the porch steps, gazing at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Thanks for your support today, Richard said, joining his brother. Thomas nodded. Family protects its own, even family that's been apart for 27 years. I keep thinking about what Mason said, Richard mused, about creating a school where differences are valued rather than just accommodated. It's a powerful vision, Thomas agreed. Would you consider being part of it? Richard asked directly. Coming back to Portland with us, helping to create something new. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I've built my life here, Richard. My business, my reputation in the conservation community. I understand, Richard said, trying to mask his disappointment. It was presumptuous to ask. I didn't say no, Thomas clarified. Just that it would be a significant change. One I'd need to consider carefully. Hope flickered in Richard's chest. Of course. Take all the time you need. Thomas turned to face his brother. Mason needs you now more than he needs me. The aftermath of ending your marriage, creating a new home environment, that's your priority. You're right, Richard acknowledged. But having you in our lives, in whatever capacity works for you, would mean a great deal to both of us. Let me think about it, Thomas said simply. In the meantime, why don't we focus on the present? Mason mentioned wanting to visit the tide pools tomorrow before the afternoon rain moves in. Richard nodded, accepting his brother's need for time and space. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars multiply above the redwood canopy. Whatever Thomas ultimately decided, Richard knew with certainty that finding his brother had changed something fundamental in their family's trajectory, healing a wound that had festered, unacknowledged, for far too long. The Portland rain tapped gently against the windows of the Blackwood mansion, creating a soothing rhythm that matched the peaceful atmosphere inside. 6 months had passed since their life-changing trip to Pine Haven, and the house felt like a different place entirely. No longer a showcase of wealth and status, but a genuine home filled with purpose and warmth. Richard paused in the doorway of Mason's room, watching as his son carefully tended to the collection of native plants that now occupied a specially designed shelf by his window. Thomas had helped create the indoor garden, complete with grow lights that mimicked natural sunlight patterns. Almost ready? Richard asked. The contractors want to meet us at the site in an hour. Mason looked up with a grin. Just finishing up. Uncle Thomas taught me how to check the soil moisture properly, and I promised I'd take care of these until he visits next week. The mention of Thomas brought a smile to Richard's face. Though his brother had decided to remain in Pine Haven, maintaining his botanical sanctuary, he visited Portland regularly, staying in the guest house Richard had converted from the former pool house. The brothers had established a rhythm of connection, different from what might have been without their long separation, but meaningful nonetheless. Nancy's already in the car, Richard said. She's as excited as we are to see the progress. Mason carefully wiped his hands and maneuvered his wheelchair toward the door. I still can't believe it's really happening. Believe it, Richard assured him. The Blackwood Academy for Innovative Learning will welcome its first students in just 4 months. The transformation of the past half-year still amazed Richard when he reflected on it. The divorce from Vanessa had proceeded with surprising smoothness once she realized Richard's resolve was unshakable. The generous settlement specified in their prenuptial agreement had softened the blow to her pride, and her quick engagement to a real estate developer suggested she had already moved on to fresh prospects. More significantly, Richard had restructured his role at Blackwood Manufacturing, delegating day-to-day operations to his capable executive team while he focused on establishing the Blackwood Academy, the school Mason had envisioned during their stay with Thomas. The drive to the school site took them through Portland's western outskirts, where 15 acres of gently rolling woodland now housed a campus under construction. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Mason's face lit up at the sight of the buildings taking shape among the trees. "Look, Dad, they've started the greenhouse dome." Indeed, the skeletal framework of a geodesic dome rose from the center of the campus, the future home of the Botanical Learning Center that would serve as the heart of the school's unique curriculum. Lisa Chen, the lead architect, greeted them as they parked. "Perfect timing," she said warmly. "We just installed the accessibility features in the North Wing classrooms and would love your feedback." Mason had become an integral part of the design process, his perspective proving invaluable in creating spaces that were truly accessible, rather than merely compliant with regulations. His involvement had expanded beyond accessibility issues to curriculum development, where his natural curiosity and thoughtful approach impressed the educational consultants Richard had hired. As they toured the site, Richard observed the easy way the contractors and designers interacted with Mason, asking his opinion, listening attentively to his suggestions, treating him as a collaborator rather than a child to be humored. It was everything Richard had hoped for when they embarked on this project. "The sensory garden is coming along beautifully," Lisa explained as they approached a partially completed space near the administrative building. "We've implemented all of Thomas's recommendations for plant selection and terrain design. He'll be pleased," Richard noted. "He's bringing more native specimens when he visits next week." Thomas's contribution to the academy extended far beyond occasional consultations. He had designed all the outdoor learning spaces, created a specialized curriculum for ecological studies, and agreed to lead summer workshops for both students and teachers. His expertise had transformed what might have been a well-intentioned but conventional approach into something truly innovative. After completing the tour, they gathered in the temporary site office to review the construction timeline. Nancy, who had been quietly observing throughout, finally spoke up. "Have you decided about the dedication plaque?" she asked Richard. The question touched on something Richard had been contemplating for weeks. "Actually," he said, "I wanted to discuss that with Mason first." When the meeting concluded and they were alone, Richard turned to his son. "I've been thinking that we should name the central garden after your mother. The Eleanor Blackwood Memorial Garden. What do you think?" Mason's eyes brightened with emotion. She would have loved that. Especially since the whole school was kind of her idea in a way. "How do you figure that?" Richard asked curiously. "Well," Mason explained, "if she hadn't left that letter with Nancy, we never would have found Uncle Thomas. And if we hadn't found him, I wouldn't have gotten the idea for the school. So really, she started all of this." Richard nodded, moved by his son's perspective. "You're absolutely right. Your mother always saw possibilities that others missed. Like Uncle Thomas does," Mason added. "Like you do," Richard corrected gently. As they drove home through the autumn afternoon, Richard reflected on the journey of the past 6 months. The pain of ending his marriage to Vanessa had been real but necessary, like setting a broken bone so it could heal properly. More challenging had been the process of examining his own failures as a father, the ways he had allowed work to consume time that should have been spent with Mason, the signs of Vanessa's cruelty he had missed or ignored. One evening during their stay in Pine Haven, Richard had made a devastating discovery. While helping Mason organize his backpack for a field expedition with Thomas, he had found a small blue notebook tucked into a hidden pocket. Curious, he had opened it, only to find page after page of painful entries, cruel comments Vanessa had made to Mason when they were alone, recorded in his careful handwriting, along with the dates and circumstances. "You estraga tudo." Mason had documented the Portuguese phrase Vanessa had used when angry, noting that he had looked it up later. "You ruin everything. Your father only feels sorry for you. No one wants to play with a broken boy. If you didn't exist, this house would be lighter." Each entry had been like a physical blow to Richard's heart. That night, he had wept alone in his room, overwhelmed by grief for his son's silent suffering and shame at his own failure to protect him. The next morning, Richard had made a promise to himself and silently to Eleanor. Mason would never again feel unseen or unwelcome in his own home. Every decision, every priority would be realigned with that commitment at its center. The changes hadn't all been easy. Restructuring his role at Blackwood Manufacturing had meant disappointing some board members and losing a few business connections who viewed his new focus as a distraction. The Hamilton merger had proceeded, but without Richard's full attention leaving some questioning. His dedication to the company's continued growth, but the rewards far outweighed the costs. Mason had flourished in the new environment, his natural intelligence and creativity blossoming as he felt increasingly secure. His physical therapy progressed more rapidly than doctors had predicted, and he had recently begun experimenting with forearm crutches for short distances, determined to greet the Academy's first students on his feet, even if just briefly. Nancy, too, had found a new purpose. Richard had officially made her Mason's legal guardian in the event anything happened to him, a role she had accepted with characteristic quiet dignity. Additionally, she had taken on an administrative position at the Academy, where her practical wisdom and unwavering ethical compass would help shape the school's culture from its inception. As for Thomas, the reconnection had healed something in both brothers that neither had fully acknowledged was broken. Their weekly phone calls and regular visits had gradually built a relationship that honored their shared past while creating space for who they had become as adults. Thomas remained committed to his work in Pinehaven, but had expanded his business to include educational components that aligned with the Academy's mission, creating a partnership that benefited both ventures. When they arrived home, Mason headed straight for his room to document the day's developments in the journal he kept about the Academy's creation. Richard found himself drawn to his study, where Eleanor's photograph still held the place of honor on his desk. He sat for a moment, studying the face of the woman who had loved their son so completely that she had reached beyond her own passing to ensure his needs would be met. "We're doing it." "Hell," he said softly to the photograph, creating the kind of family Mason deserves. "It's not what we planned, but I think you'd approve." A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Nancy stood in the doorway, a letter in her hand. "This came while we were out," she said, extending the envelope toward him. "From Thomas." Richard opened it curiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing a brief note and what appeared to be a legal document. "He's donating 5 acres of his Pinehaven property to the Academy," Richard explained after scanning the contents, "for a satellite campus focusing on ecological restoration. He wants Mason to help design it." Nancy smiled. "Mrs. Eleanor would be pleased." "The circle completing itself. What do you mean?" Richard asked. "She believed in connections," Nancy explained. "That people come into our lives for reasons we don't always understand immediately. She told me once that Mason would need different kinds of love than we could provide alone, that someday the family would need to expand in unexpected ways to meet his needs." Richard considered this. She couldn't have known about Thomas specifically. No, Nancy agreed. But she trusted that the right people would appear when needed, if we were brave enough to recognize them. As if summoned by their conversation, Mason wheeled into the study, excitement evident in his expression. "Dad, I've been thinking about the winter garden for the Academy," he began. "What if we created a special section dedicated to plants that thrive in difficult conditions? Uncle Thomas says they're called resilient species, plants that can adapt to challenging environments and still flourish." The metaphor wasn't lost on Richard. "That sounds perfect," he agreed. "A garden of resilience." Later that evening, as Richard helped Mason with his stretching exercises, his son asked a question that caught him off guard. "Do you think Vanessa will ever come see the school when it's finished?" Richard considered his response carefully. "I don't know. Would you want her to?" Mason was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful. "I think so. Not because I miss her or anything, but because I want her to see that I'm not what she thought. That being different isn't being less." The mature perspective humbled Richard. "That's very generous of you." Mason shrugged. "Uncle Thomas says that sometimes people who hurt others are just afraid of what they don't understand. Maybe seeing the school would help her understand better." "Perhaps," Richard acknowledged, though privately he doubted Vanessa had the capacity for such growth. "But either way, what you're creating is important, regardless of who recognizes its value. "We're creating it," Mason corrected. "You, me, Uncle Thomas, Nancy, all of us together." Richard smiled at the amendment. "You're right. It's a family project in the truest sense." As Christmas approached, Thomas arrived for an extended visit, bringing with him specially cultivated blue roses for the indoor garden, a tribute to Eleanor, who had loved the rare flowers. The three Blackwood men and Nancy spent the holiday season in a comfortable rhythm of shared meals, project planning, and quiet evenings by the fire. On Christmas Eve, they gathered in the living room, where a modest tree glittered with the handmade ornaments Eleanor had collected during her lifetime. Thomas had brought a new addition, a delicate glass sphere containing preserved woodland flora from Pinehaven, which now hung in a place of honor. "A toast," Richard proposed, raising his glass. "To family, found, reconnected, and chosen. To Mom," Mason added softly, "who knew what we would need before we did. To new beginnings," Thomas contributed, "and the courage to embrace them." Nancy completed the circle, to seeing each person for who they truly are. As they clinked glasses, Richard felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The path that had led them here was neither straight nor easy, but standing in this room with the people who mattered most, he knew they had arrived exactly where they were meant to be. 3 months later, on a crisp spring morning, the Blackwood Academy for Innovative Learning welcomed visitors for its pre-opening celebration. The building stood complete among the trees, pathways winding between classrooms, laboratories, art studios, and gardens designed to engage students of all abilities and learning styles. At the entrance to the central garden, now officially named the Eleanor Blackwood Memorial Garden, Mason stood supported by his forearm crutches, greeting guests alongside his father and uncle. Though he could maintain this position for only 20 minutes before needing to return to his wheelchair, the accomplishment represented months of determined effort. Education officials, community members, and the families of prospective students explored the campus, many expressing wonder at the thoughtful design that made learning accessible to children with diverse needs and abilities. The botanical dome drew particular attention, its transparent panels allowing sunlight to nurture the carefully selected plants within, while providing an inspiring space for hands-on learning. As Richard watched Mason enthusiastically explaining the sensory garden features to a group of parents, he felt a presence beside him. Nancy had approached quietly, her expression serene as she observed the scene. "He's found his purpose," she noted, "just as Mrs. Eleanor always said he would." "We all have," Richard replied, "in ways I never could have imagined 6 months ago." The academy would open officially the following month, welcoming its inaugural class of 60 students ranging from kindergarten through 8th grade. Applications had exceeded available spaces by a factor of 3, confirming the need for the specialized approach they offered. Already, Thomas was working with educational consultants to document their methodology, creating resources that could help other schools implement similar programs. The Blackwood Foundation had committed to funding pilot projects in 5 additional locations across the country, with Mason insisting that at least 2 be in underserved communities. As the celebration continued, Richard found himself standing before the dedication plaque at the garden entrance. The simple bronze marker read, "The Eleanor Blackwood Memorial Garden, where every child is seen, valued, and encouraged to grow in their own unique way." Below this, in smaller lettering, "Inspired by Mason Blackwood, created with love by the Blackwood family." Thomas joined him, both brothers silent as they contemplated the legacy taking shape before them. "She would be proud," Thomas said finally. "Of all of you." "Of all of us," Richard corrected. "You're part of this family too, Thomas. Always have been, even when we were apart." Thomas nodded, acceptance in his eyes where once there might have been doubt. "I've been thinking about spending more time in Portland," he said casually. "The satellite campus will need regular attention, and I've had some interest from research institutions here about collaborative projects." Hope rose in Richard's chest. "The guest house is yours whenever you want it, for as long as you want." "I was thinking of something more permanent," Thomas admitted. "A small place of my own, but nearby. I'd like to be more present in Mason's life as he grows up." "If that's agreeable to you." "More than agreeable," Richard assured him. "It's exactly what we both want." As they spoke, Mason approached, his face flushed with excitement. "Dad, Uncle Thomas, come quick. The blue roses in the greenhouse. They're blooming!" Weeks earlier than expected. The brothers exchanged a glance, both remembering Eleanor's words from her letter. The roses will know when the time is right. Together, they followed May